At this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired. I'm Sarah Vallely, professional coach. I help people overcome anxiety, heal from past trauma, improve their relationships, and maintain better work-life balance. Welcome back to the show. I am here with Mike Comparetto. He is a licensed therapist who owns his own practice, overseeing several other therapists in his practice. Mike specializes in anxiety and uses acceptance commitment therapy approach, which we're going to talk about more today. Mike, welcome back to the show. I'm so glad you're here. It's been way too long.
I know. It's been a while. It's good to be back.
Sure is. I want to talk about acceptance commitment therapy here just for a minute before we go into the topic of our show today. And I want to back up a little bit first for the listeners. When we start therapy, we often don't think about the fact that there's all these different kinds of approaches that therapists use. And one therapist might use one approach and another therapist might use a completely different approach. There is CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of people are familiar with that. There's DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. Some people are aware of that. Internal family systems is gaining more popularity. Somatic work is something that's been out there for several years. And there is this approach called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which in my opinion doesn't get enough attention. It's a wonderful approach to mental health, and there is such a big component of mindfulness in ACT therapy, which is why Mike and I just love talking on this show about mindfulness. Mike, you can correct me if you're wrong, but it's my understanding that ACT is part of the cognitive behavioral therapy world. It's based on helping clients accept unpleasant thoughts and feelings instead of fighting or avoiding them. And ACT encourages people to observe their experiences with mindfulness and compassion. So if any of my clients are listening, they know this is what we talk about in our sessions. So what you're going to hear in this episode is going to be very familiar and supporting what we're already doing. So Mike, can you talk a little bit more about ACT, including what types of mental health issues you see this approach really helping?
Sure. I mean, it can theoretically address most mental health issues. I'm not going to say all. Let's say anything that the average person would be coming to therapy for. So anxiety, depression, OCD, trauma, anything that doesn't fall under the category of extremely severe or complex, I would say it would be a great approach. Theoretically, it can address most, if not all, things. And it is, as you correctly pointed out, it is under the umbrella of CBT. It really focuses on the idea of behavior, but where there's a little bit of a loophole is that in ACT, kind of everything's a behavior. The way you're thinking is a behavior, ruminating is a behavior, beating yourself up is a behavior. So behaviors are not just, I'm going out and doing this thing. For the record, I do all of the things that you mentioned. ACT is probably my favorite of all of those, but it's like having a Swiss Army knife. You need to have different strategies to lean on if something comes up. And as you pointed out, one of the big differences between CBT and ACT is the way thoughts are approached. The traditional approach in CBT is to try to what we call reframing thoughts. So let's say you have a negative thought like, oh, I'm such a loser. The approach would be, let's think about that differently. Is there any evidence that actually contradicts that thought, I'm a loser? Whereas in ACT, we try not to give thoughts too much power at all. So the idea in ACT would be more so, well, that's just a thought. I'm going to let that go. And personally, I actually find both of those strategies to be incredibly useful at different times.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about this idea of having different tools. An example I can give is, I do internal family systems work too, IFS, and I find that it doesn't really, I don't think it works well to start a client off right away with IFS. It's a very intimate type of
Yeah.
work. So it's nice to have something that's more cognitive based. I'll often start with the cognitive, reframing, things like that in the beginning, develop some trust, have the client start to really feel safe, because you really do need to have a lot of trust and feel safe when doing the IFS work. So yeah, it's nice to have those different modalities.
Yeah, and I personally practice what I would call a top down approach, meaning if a client comes in, I'm not necessarily on day one going to try to go right for the root of the problem. There's exceptions to that, but for the most part, I start with trying to teach a client tools to manage their symptoms and learn to cope with what they're experiencing before we start getting to the deeper root levels of what's going on, because that can having those tools before doing the real heavy lifting can be really beneficial.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. The focus of our episode today is on experiential avoidance, which I'll be honest, I just learned this term the other day when Mike emailed this to me. I love it. I love this because it is a research term. It was coined by ACT. Experiential avoidance is a research term. Another research term that I love to talk about is cognitive elaboration, which means worry, basically. More specifically, when we don't have all the information, we fill in the blanks with our own notions. And the research shows that this leads to anxiety and depression, just like rumination, just like shame thinking. Experiential avoidance means avoiding or suppressing uncomfortable emotions, uncomfortable physical sensations, uncomfortable memories, uncomfortable situations. Of course, I always talk about this with clients, but I didn't know this is what it was called. So I'm so excited. I'm going to share some stats here about experiential avoidance. The Journal of Advanced Nursing published a study that shows those of us who engage in experiential avoidance are 48% more likely to have depression, anxiety, or PTSD, and 30% would be statistically significant. So 48% is a lot. The Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science published a study that showed experiential avoidance was linked to physical health issues, such as obesity, diabetes, allergies, cancer, heart disease, gastrointestinal problems, and respiratory diseases. So I found that very interesting. Another study showed if you engage in experiential avoidance, meaning avoiding certain situations, avoiding your emotions, difficult emotions, you are 68% more likely to use self-harm.
Mm.
Ooh, that seems like really important finding with what's going on with a lot of teens these days. And the last statistic here, a study in current psychology showed experiential avoidance makes eating disorders worse. So yeah, Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these stats and your, explanation of what experiential avoidance is.
Yeah, I mean, those stats definitely don't surprise me. Just to kind of restate what you already outlined, because I think since it's an unfamiliar term, I think it probably bears repeating to kind of define it. It's any attempt to avoid any part of your present experience. That can be your thoughts, it could be your emotions, it could be your physiological sensations, it could be memories that arise, it could be external situations. And I think the first and possibly most important thing to say here is that it's not possible to completely eliminate experiential avoidance. One thing that I find really cool about ACT, it's a very flexible modality, and it doesn't propose anything be black and white. It has a very sort of adaptable approach to life. We're all going to do this sometimes. All going to have that night where we're just like, you know what? I'm going to check out and binge my favorite show. And that is not inherently bad. However, if it is a pattern and if there is emotional content that needs to be processed that you're continually avoiding, it will make things worse. And specifically, we're mostly talking about anxiety today. A pretty well understood mechanism of anxiety is that if you avoid dealing with the anxiety or facing the fear that you're experiencing, you will typically get some degree of short term relief. However, in the long run, it will cause your anxiety to exacerbate. And this is exactly what happened to me when I look back over my life. I can look at the way I experienced anxiety when I was young and how it was very sort of specific and in certain situations. Not only did that anxiety get worse, it became generalized, which means rather than being triggered by specific interactions or specific stimuli, it started to just become a way of life. Whatever it is that makes you anxious when you're first starting to experience anxiety, the more you avoid that, the more your anxiety actually grows. And we may have talked about this on a previous podcast episode, but if you think about the idea of your comfort zone, the smaller your comfort zone is, and the more you stay in that, the smaller it will become. Think of it like a muscle. If you don't exercise that muscle, it will not grow. And as a matter of fact, if you don't use it at all, it will atrophy. What we want to do is figure out how do we start to face those things. And that's kind of where I'm sure you have a plan for how we're going to get into that, but that's essentially where we're going.
I actually didn't make as much of a plan as I usually do because you're just so good. You're like such a good guest. Like,
Oh,
I'm
thank
so
you.
glad Mike's on. Like, I don't have to work so hard. Yeah. So we both have a background in Buddhism, and I love how you described about how when we avoid, it can make things worse. And that's based in Buddhism, right? And in Buddhism, we believe that what we push away gains more power. It's like that aversion. We use the word aversion in Buddhism. And I like to think about the biological reason. I haven't researched this or asked ChatGPT about this. It didn't occur to me when I was getting ready for today, but I would imagine the biological reason for experiential avoidance is some kind of like survival, right?
Yes.
Like thinking about our ancestors and having, certain things just be like, I'm not going to survive if I lean into this. Like I could get hurt by the enemy or something like that. So I'm sure it's the way our brain is designed. And I like that you reminded us that, it's okay if we kind of go into this, here and there, have a drink once in a while because we had a hard day, but, noticing those habitual patterns that make it worse. And this idea that we need to lean into those fears to help us heal our anxiety, I have seen with every single one of my clients, when they learn how to process their emotions, their anxiety gets much better. And for me personally, I'm not a super emotional person, but the last 5 years or so, I've done a lot of work in this realm and have been able to become more emotional. My anxiety is much, much better. But I'll be honest, having those emotions isn't a cakewalk either, but it's better on your body. First of all, like the anxiety does has these negative impacts on your body. I think allowing a real emotion of grief and loss to come through has a healthier effect on your body, and it overall, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, it feels better than anxiety, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the phrase, there's no free lunch. You can get away with avoiding that stuff for a little while and maybe not have any real consequence. Another saying I love is pick your pain. You're either going to have the pain of facing the feelings or the pain of the consequence of avoiding them. In the short term, it feels like the much better thing to do is to avoid them. It can be very hard to connect the dots and realize that in the long term, as things get worse, it's because you were avoiding. And it can also be hard to recognize how you're avoiding. I mean, we've talked about some of the more obvious examples, but there's some really subtle examples. And one of the things that I found really cool getting deeper into ACT, it's kind of a mindfulness practice for the therapist, watching your clients and looking for the ways in which they engage in subtle experiential avoidance in real time as you're talking. It can be as subtle as a little, like the eyes shifting away or the hands starting to fidget. You wouldn't immediately think of as, oh, this is me trying to avoid, but what it is a very natural response of trying to self-soothe. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying self-soothing is a bad thing, but again, we have to look at the overall pattern and the overall tendency. If you're never spending any time sitting with an emotion or facing a fear, then self-soothing is just a band-aid. Everything from our muscles tensing up to going on a different train of thought when we encounter a scary idea. There's essentially an infinite number of ways we can experientially avoid. The goal is not to find and root out every single one of those things and assume that it's always bad. It's to prioritize the ones that are contributing the most to this feedback loop that we're talking about. That's where the acceptance part of acceptance and commitment therapy comes in to really replace that avoidance with acceptance.
Wonderful. Yeah, I want to let our listeners know that in the show notes, I have a link to an online assessment to see where you fall on the spectrum of experiential avoidance. Some of the questions include, am I quick to leave a situation that makes me feel uneasy? Do I try to put unpleasant memories out of my mind? Do I procrastinate? Do I believe pain always leads to suffering? So you can check that out. And yeah, so it's this idea that we're distracting ourselves with substances, overwork, food, media. Mine is definitely work. And that's because I get the most dopamine hits from work. So that's my challenge. Perfectionism is an example of this type of avoidance. And I would say that's because we want to avoid those shame cycles coming up that I'm not good enough. I make mistakes. And so we really lean into being perfect to avoid that. We talked about this a little bit already, but I want to ask you again, why does this experiential avoidance lead to long-term suffering, to more anxiety, that it's bad for us? And I know when we spoke before, you'd mentioned this idea of this quicksand. So I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so to go over the quicksand analogy, if you imagine yourself in quicksand, what are we always told? The more you struggle, the more you're going to sink into the quicksand. There's a lot of mechanisms that we can use to explain why this is, because it's a good question. Well, why does experiential avoidance make things worse? And the first and most obvious is that we're just not dealing with the problem. We're ignoring the problem. One way I like to think about the function of emotions is as messengers, right? They are messengers from your brain and body. Those messages might be totally flawed and irrational, but nonetheless, if somebody's knocking on your door and you just keep ignoring it and they're very insistent, they're going to keep knocking, and you could turn your TV up as loud as you want. The knocking's not going to stop until you answer the door. We can actually fold in a little bit of IFS here. Think about the ways in which you have parts that protect your exiles. So those of you who aren't familiar, just think of exiles as your deepest wounding, your traumas, your negative core beliefs, the worst experiences of your life, right? You have other parts that show up to try to protect you when those exiles feel vulnerable. Sometimes that's done in a healthy way, but oftentimes that's done through experiential avoidance. And in IFS, the way to heal those exiles is to start to let those protective parts step back a tiny bit and to start to really address the exiles as they are and let them know they're safe. I'm kind of giving the Cliff Notes version here, but to essentially heal those exiles by working with them directly. To look at it from the Buddhist perspective, as you pointed out, clinging and aversion are the root of all suffering in Buddhist philosophy. They're two sides of the same coin. Typically, when we're clinging towards something, we have aversion towards something else. Or typically, when we're experiencing aversion to something, like let's say a difficult physiological sensation, we will naturally cling to something else. So let's say I'm feeling anxiety start to move through my body and it feels uncomfortable. I start to experience aversion, and then I start to cling towards, I really just want to feel better. I can only feel okay if this feeling goes away. That is, in this Buddhist model, the root of all of our suffering. By learning how to let go of clinging and aversion, we can start to reduce our suffering. By continuing to avoid, by continuing to not face what's really there, we keep shrinking our comfort zone and we keep limiting what we are okay with in life. Our life becomes small and unfulfilling. It's a recipe for more suffering and more anxiety.
Yeah, so if I'm feeling neglected, if I'm feeling misunderstood, if I'm feeling disappointed, it's not a mistake, right? It's not like, oh, that's a mistake. Let me just kind of push that down, or, that's just going to weaken me. There's a reason. And if we think about through the lens of IFS, that yes, it's these exiles, our inner child that's feeling these things, and there's a reason, and we need to listen to it, right? So that's where so much healing can come from. I believe we cannot heal emotionally until we feel our emotions in the right way. And I know you're probably not supposed to say that, but I think the idea here is that people wouldn't avoid these emotional experiences as much if they knew how to feel them in the right way. And I guess basically a better way to say that is to feel them in a more compassionate way, because what we're thinking in our heads while we're feeling the pain matters. And so I think that being able to learn that practice is super important. And also that emotional awareness in general. One more statistic here. The Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science says that people who struggle with emotional awareness, mindfulness of your emotions, are 97% more likely to engage in avoidance behaviors in this experiential avoidance. So basically everyone, right?
Yeah.
97%. Yeah, what do you think?
Well, also, I mean, just to kind of demystify it a little bit, like, can you really blame people? We are creatures that we don't like pain and we love pleasure, right? So if you're feeling even a subtle, even a subconscious emotional pain, what are you going to do? You're going to say, well, let me reach for my favorite food or reach for a drink or turn on the TV or start scrolling, right? And we can't blame people for that because that is our nature. The thing that is counterintuitive about most forms of self-growth is that they actually require us to go a little bit against our habitual nature, you know?
That's the trick, right? Breaking our patterns, changing our patterns. Mike, how do we stop avoiding these uncomfortable experiences, sitting with? What is your advice about that? Or maybe even some of your personal experience?
Yeah, I think the first thing I think I want to do is define acceptance because that is a very misunderstood word when people hear the idea, accept your emotions or accept your situation. It can often sound like, well, are you telling me I should be okay with it or I should like it? And the answer is no, not at all. Simply put, in ACT, we define acceptance as not struggling with reality. To go back to the quicksand metaphor, if you're struggling while you're in the quicksand, you're going to sink deeper. Similarly, if you're experiencing any type of difficult emotional or mental experience and you struggle with it, you will sink deeper. And to share a little bit of my own experience with anxiety, the more I found myself hating my anxiety and wanting to force it to go away, the worse it got. I experienced that quicksand metaphor so acutely and so deeply. And it took me a while to realize that by trying to avoid it, I was only making it worse. How we start to turn that ship around is first recognizing the fact that we avoid, recognizing the ways in which we do it, because you can't fix the problem until you clearly see it. Start to identify the ways in which they experientially avoid. Now, depending on the person, I might first teach them some basic grounding techniques, which I'm going to assume most of your listeners have, but it can be as simple as pausing, taking a few deep breaths, feeling your feet on the ground, feeling your body in the chair, and just let things be. And that is a form of acceptance. When we start to identify the ways in which we're avoiding, we can start to replace them with acceptance strategies. And this entirely depends on what we're avoiding. So if it's an internal state that we're avoiding, then maybe the antidote is to do a simple mindfulness meditation where we're really focusing on that act of acceptance. I forget, I want to say it was Ajahn Sumedho, but there's a monk who had this really well-known phrase, right now it's like this. And that is one of my favorite mantras. You know, you could go through your whole day and in those challenging moments just take a deep breath. Right now it's like this, right? But to expand on the idea of acceptance, I also think it's important to note that it does not mean not taking action. Acceptance does not mean resignation. It doesn't mean giving up. It just means not struggling. And so this becomes especially important when we're talking about life situations and socio-political issues even. Acceptance doesn't mean I hate my job, but I'm just going to stay here because that's, I'm just going to accept it. No, acceptance can mean taking action, but first you have to start with meeting reality where it's at. Because if you're struggling with the fact that you don't like your job, you're only going to suffer that much more, and it's going to be that much difficult to see clearly what the next steps are to move out of that. There's these more internal approaches to acceptance like mindfulness meditation, but then there's some external behaviors that we need to address. Like, let's say you've got social anxiety and you're avoiding social gatherings. Well, that's when you would do what we call exposure therapy, right? Where you slowly, in a measured way, and hopefully with the help of a professional, start to face those fears so that you are no longer avoiding those scary situations. You start to do the things that you are afraid of, starting with the ones that feel a little bit easier. And it will be challenging, but that is also the point, that without feeling the anxiety that comes with facing a fear, you can't push through it and overcome it.
What you were saying about this acceptance doesn't mean non-action, which John Kabat-Zinn talks about really well. And I want to give an example of that. If you are in an abusive relationship and you don't accept that it is abusive, you're just in denial about it, then you don't take action. So actually moving into acceptance about the reality that, yes, I'm in an abusive relationship allows you to take that action to end the relationship and be safe. Yeah, that is a misconception that, when we accept something that we're accepting, we're like going to be okay with whatever happens and we're not taking action. It's just literally accepting that this is the reality. This is the reality of what's going on. And the right now it's like this, one of my favorite mantras, it's just radical acceptance. It's just like, yes, right now my nervous system is triggered. Yes, I'm having approaching an anxiety attack. This is what's going on, and just completely accepting that that's what's happening instead of fighting it, which will make the anxiety attack worse. So yeah, this idea of how do we stop avoiding these uncomfortable situations, naming the emotion, that emotional awareness, I think that is key. And so I will also link in the show notes my tool that lists 300 emotions, so you can go on there and put some words to the emotion. I haven't always believed this, but in the last couple of years, I've come to realize that every single instance of overthinking is driven by an emotion. So that's also a really good place to start, is every time you notice yourself overthinking, that would be worry, rumination, shame thinking, so much problem solving, so much projecting, planning, that type of overthinking, to just take a moment and say, I'm in this overthinking. There's got to be an emotional aspect here that I'm actually avoiding with this overthinking. That is so helpful for my clients. I want to ask about values. I know that acceptance commitment therapy involves a lot of understanding of values and making sure that we're aligning our life with our values. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how this experiential avoidance plays a role in a barrier to really being in alignment with our values.
Yeah, so just to kind of set the stage for that, one of the cool and somewhat unique things about acceptance and commitment therapy is the way happiness is defined. One of the sort of official definitions of happiness in ACT is living a rich, full, and meaningful life. And you'll notice that definition says nothing about pleasure and it says nothing about the presence or absence of difficult or negative emotions. You can still have a happy, rich, full, meaningful life, get satisfaction out of your life, even in the presence of anxiety. The anxiety does not have to go away before you are able to be happy. And I'm sure we can all think of examples where we have experienced this in our life, right? You can think of times, happy memories where you were actually experiencing some kind of difficult emotion. You know, I often think about when I graduated college, I felt this weird mix of like happiness and sadness at the same time. And they did not cancel each other out. They just both existed. Or I can think of moments where I had to do something really hard, but I felt really proud and fulfilled for doing that, even though it was incredibly hard and depending on what it was, you know, maybe physically or emotionally painful. At the end of our lives, when we look back over our lives, we are not going to be focusing on the times when we had the most pleasure. Oh, that time I was watching my favorite show and I had the perfect meal with the perfect little dopamine rush. We are going to be looking back on the moments in which we felt the most fulfilled and satisfied. That's where the values come in. So, our core values are the things that matter most to us. Values can be things like integrity, honesty, loyalty, mindfulness, compassion, kindness. You know, those are just some random examples of what core values could be. Everybody's different and everybody's going to have their own core values. If you are living a life that is out of alignment with your values, not only are you going to be less satisfied and fulfilled in your life, but I think you're much more likely to exacerbate your anxiety. Whereas if you're living a life where you are engaged with your values, you might still have some anxiety, but it's not going to be as predominant and it's not going to get worse in the same way, again assuming you're not engaging in as much experiential avoidance. I mean, essentially, if you want to be a little bit hyperbolic about it, like following your core values is a recipe for happiness. Obviously life is never that simple, but you know, it's a pretty good rule to live by. Values are all about how you do something. So there's less of an emphasis on what you do and more of an emphasis on how you do something. In other words, if a client comes to me and says like, well, I don't know, like, how am I supposed to live in line with my values when I don't do that much or see that many people? And I'm like, well, do you go to the store? Do you have a chance to interact with the cashier at the store? Do you have the chance to hold the door for somebody as they're coming out behind you? Do you have the chance to view anything you do as an opportunity to engage your values? And that is where you can get really creative and say, well, every little thing is an opportunity to engage with my values if I approach it correctly. It really is a huge part of finding some happiness and contentment in life.
Very good. When you were talking about you can have anxiety and happiness at the same time, it made me think of what I call the joy pain experience when you truly open up your heart. I mean, there's joy there and there's also pain. During the pandemic, being out on my paddleboard in the middle of the lake and just collapsing on my paddleboard in tears for all the kids who had to go through, you know, everything that they were going through, having such pain about that. But also, since my heart was so open, I also felt some joy that I was able to experience this, that I was able to be so heart centered that I could just be so connected to all these children and what they were going through. So that happening simultaneously is a very interesting, freeing experience.
If I had to guess, I would say some of your core values have something to do with kindness or compassion or connection. And so in that moment you were engaging with your core values, and that's part of why you felt happy.
Yeah, I felt good about being able to be so real in that moment. It just felt like a real moment. You reflect on your life and you can kind of pick out like these few moments. It's just, you were just so being so real, so authentic. Yeah.
Yeah, authenticity is a core value. The general theme here is not thinking that eliminating pain and maximizing pleasure is going to help you in the long run is a trap, you know? And I know that's tough because that is, again, that is kind of our essential nature. What gave me the idea for this podcast topic to begin with was I was actually looking for interesting topics to talk about by asking ChatGPT, you know, what's an interesting angle on talking about anxiety, and it came back with this thing that said, I tried to meditate my anxiety away, right? And it's funny because when I look at the trajectory of my own personal journey with anxiety, meditation is one of the number one things that has helped me. However, if I'm being honest with myself, in the early years, there were times where it was actually experiential avoidance, or I was trying to avoid what I was feeling. In those moments, anxiety was no different than a Xanax. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Xanax is always bad for people to take, but if you're just trying to mask a symptom and not actually address what's underneath it, it'll only get you so far. I think when I was like maybe 22 or something, I read Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach, which I feel like is just, you know, necessary reading for anybody looking to do this kind of work. It definitely kind of shifted my perspective on what I was doing. It forced me to get more embodied, really look at, can I just be present in my body and feel the sensations that are happening and just be with them and accept them. It also forced me to see some of the ways in which I was, you know, maybe even using meditation as an avoidance.
So about 10 years ago, I was meditating like crazy. I was going on multi-day retreats. When I didn't have my kids for the weekend, I would just do my own retreat in my home and meditate for, 2 days straight almost. And I noticed that my personality was changing. I wasn't laughing as much. I was just very like monotone. And I noticed I didn't want to celebrate birthdays anymore because it didn't make any sense to me. I was like, every moment's just the same moment over and over, and a birthday doesn't really make any sense to me. I mean, I went into this place and I actually intentionally, consciously decided to not meditate as much because I was noticing what effect it was having on me.
There's definitely a tendency with some people who meditate to want to use it like a tranquilizer and try to achieve some kind of like unrealistic serene state. Now, I think there is a realistic state you can strive for, but it has to be done with non attachment and it has to be done in a healthy way. We could get into a whole other podcast about spiritual bypassing, but I think that is kind of the theme there. Another quick tip for people who want to actually use their meditation practice to not avoid is to just take a few seconds in your meditation to sit and get grounded, and then just ask yourself, needs to be felt right now, or what's wanting my attention, and to just have that open, curious attitude. And that doesn't even have to be done as a meditation practice. It could just be done as a moment in time where you're sitting at work and you're answering emails and you notice there's something going on under the surface, and you just sit back in your chair and you say, huh, what's wanting my attention? What needs to be felt? In a lot of ways, I actually think those sort of integrated practices in our day to day life are more important than a formal seated meditation practice. I used to have my teacher back in New York, Josh Corda, he used to say, like, okay, great, you're meditating 30 minutes a day. What are you doing for the other 15 and a half waking hours? Are you leaving your practice on the cushion? That really resonated with me because it is something you can integrate with your life. You can find moments in real time to practice acceptance, and that's one of the things that ACT aims to do, is to teach those skills and find ways to do that, rather than it having to be this sort of official moment where, okay, now I'm going to practice acceptance. It's something you integrate into your life.
Yeah, and Mike, you're saying we don't need to stop meditating, which is kind of how I made it sound. You're
Yeah.
saying just meditate differently, meditate with more curiosity, which is the right answer. Yeah, and I think that that curiosity is so key here. You cannot avoid, you are not avoiding if you are being curious. Right. So
Yeah.
just that act of being more curious about what's going on in my body, what's going on in my emotions is a great way to be less avoidant and very rooted in mindfulness practice. The curiosity piece is very important. Well, Mike, it's been so great talking to you. What a great conversation. Listeners, if you liked this episode, you can check out the last episode that Mike was on with me about self-worth, and that episode was uploaded on June 28th, 2024. Mike, I'd love for you to take a few minutes and share a little bit more about your practice and how people can get a hold of you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, my practice is called Strive On Counseling. Our website is striveon.me. That's ME. Yeah, we're just a local group practice here in Asheville, North Carolina. I don't know how many of your listeners are local. It's myself and 5 other awesome therapists. It's the kind of practice where we all just really love what we do and are super passionate. One thing I did want to plug is about a year ago, I created an online course for anxiety that includes a lot of the stuff we talked about today, including some guided exercises. And you can find that on the website, striveon.me, or go directly to the link, which is striveon.me/anxiety course.
Great. Yes. And I will link your website in the show notes as well. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you. It's a pleasure as always.
The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD mindfulness production. Please check out our show notes for upcoming events and links to additional resources. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at TSD_mindfulness.